Fellas, with 4 weeks out the UFC, I don't think there's a single card that UFC fans would want to return to more than Mackenzie Dern versus Amanda Ribas, which is just classic UFC. But we're going to be breaking down every fighter that's going to be competing on UFC Vegas 101, as well as my own personal predictions for this fairly unanticipated fight night. But there's some decent fights now that we're going to go through, a lot of prospects as well. And we'll start off with the first fight, which, talking of prospects, we've got Nurullo Aliev taking on Joe Solecki. This is a short notice fight. It was supposed to be Aliev versus Yanal Ashmouz. That's now been changed to Joe Solecki on short notice. But Aliev, this dude was once a big prospect at 155. He's from 9-0. He's part of, well, I think he's born in Dagestan, or he trains from Dagestan, so he's from the area. He's got an undefeated record outside of the UFC. Then he came from the Contender Series, got a dominating win in the Contender Series where he earned a UFC contract. And then in his UFC debut when he fought Alves, actually ended up biting Alves for some reason in that fight, but ended up getting the win. And since then, he's been out all the way since February of 2023, so it's nearly been 2 years without Aliev in the octagon, which I'm sure a lot of people are happy to see him back because, like I said, this guy was once a big prospect in the 155 division. He's going to be taking on Joe Solecki, who had a decent run outside the UFC, nothing that you can really take away from it. Comes again from the Contender Series, gets a finish on the Contender Series, goes on a 3-fight winning streak, including a good win over Jim Miller, but now he's 2-3 in his last 5 fights, where he's been slam KO'd and absolutely dominated by Grant Dawson. But one thing to know about Joe Solecki is he does come from a heavy grappling or submission background. He's submitted the likes of Donald Cerrone as well. He's went to a decision with Gregory Rodriguez in grappling. So we just do a lot of kind of jiu-jitsu style grappling. But I think this is going to be very similar to Joe Solecki versus Grant Dawson, where Aliev just dominates him for the majority of the fight. I'm expecting big things from Aliev. He's been out the octagon for nearly 2 years. He was a hyped up prospect at 155. I think he's going to get the win by decision. Joe Solecki, I said this coming into the Grant Dawson fight, great jiu-jitsu, not a great wrestler. Aliev, I think, is a much more well-rounded grappler. And I think on the feet, there's nothing that Joe Solecki can really show him. I think Aliev is going to take him down and dominate him for the majority of the fight. Could even get a finish with ground and pound. Maybe if he's tuned up his striking in these couple of years, he might be able to get a finish. I also think the fact that it's short notice, I don't see how that benefits Solecki at all. He was preparing to fight Yanal Ashmouz, was Alves. Joe Solecki's coming off the couch. So I think all the stars are aligned for a solid second UFC fight for Aliev. I'm picking him to win this one by decision, but if not, I think he might be able to find a ground and pound finish. Then we've got Victoria Dudakova versus Fatima Kline. Heavy grappling match once again. Victoria Dudakova was once a big grappling prospect outside the UFC. 5 fights, 5 finishes. Comes over from the Contender Series, gets another win. And then she goes on a 2-fight win streak in the UFC. Again, a hyped up prospect until the most recent fight where she fought Sam Hughes. I think it was at UFC Abu Dhabi. And she kind of got dog-walked in that fight. She kind of got exposed a little bit for not having the best takedown offense. Going to be taking on Fatima Kline, who has a huge grappling background outside the UFC. That's her main base. This big grappling background previous to even MMA, where she did a lot of grappling. Then she starts MMA, goes on a decent winning streak, becomes a double champion in a promotion, and then gets dominated in a UFC debut by Jasmine Jasudavicius, but she's now ranked, so that's not really to be ashamed of. So I am going to be going with Fatima Kline to win this one by decision. I've heard that she's a massive favourite, which shouldn't really be the case, but I just don't really know how good Victoria Dudakova's grappling actually is. I know she looked really good in the regional scene, and it's not like Fatima Kline's beating anyone good either, but this big grappling background especially the fact that Dudakova couldn't really get going with the grappling against Sam Hughes. If anyone was really dominated with the grappling, not necessarily dominated, but winning with the grappling exchanges in Dudakova's most recent fight, it would have been Sam Hughes. I think Fatima Kline's got the upper hand in this fight, at least with the grappling. I think on the feet, neither of them really have anything to offer. Dudakova's striking is subpar. Kline actually looks pretty decent on the feet, and she debuted against Jasudavicius, who's a really good wrestler and he's ranked as well. So I think Kline's going to win this one. It's a bit of a coin flip. It's not like I'm super confident she's going to win, but if I had to go with one, I think the better grappler is Fatima Kline. I'm picking her to win this one by decision. Then we have Magomed Ghadziasulov versus Bruno Lopes. We've got Magomed Ghadziasulov, another one of these kind of prospects in the light heavyweight division, 9-0, undefeated. Decent run outside the UFC, fighting in the likes of Eagle FC and Brave CF, so you can kind of get an idea of which part of the world he's from. Debuted on the Contender Series, got a decent win in the Contender Series, wasn't an extremely dominant win, but looked pretty good. Then he fought Brenton Ribeiro, where he kind of just dominated him for the rest of the fight with his grappling, and did all right on the feet as well. Going to be taking on Bruno Lopes. Very dangerous guy. Nearly every single one of his wins, I think every single one of his wins do come by way of finish. It was very dangerous, or at least he was on the regional scene. Then he faces Brenton Ribeiro, the same guy that Magomed Ghadziasulov recently beat, and ends up getting finished by him on the Contender Series. But after another win, another finish in LFA, he gets another chance at the Contender Series, and he gets a finish, and now he's earned a UFC contract. This is a tough fight for Ghadziasulov. Bruno Lopes is a very dangerous guy, both with the grappling and on the feet. He kind of reminds me a bit of like an Azamat Mirzakhanov, had Mirzakhanov had a little bit better grappling. But I'm going to go with Ghadziasulov to win this one by decision. He looks pretty good from everywhere. This Ghadzi's not amazing everywhere. He's not like an elite fighter. You know, he's not the most dangerous guy. He's definitely nowhere near as dangerous as Lopes. If I'm going to pick somebody to win by stoppage, it would be Lopes. But I think the grappling of Ghadziasulov is going to be, you know, the upper hand in this fight. I can see him taking Lopes down. I can see him controlling him a lot. Not necessarily getting a submission, but I can see him doing a lot of controlling with the grappling. And on the feet, I think the technical striker, where I'd have to give it to Ghadziasulov. I think he's a better technical striker. Lopes might be the more wild and dangerous striker. I just trust that Ghadziasulov is going to get this one done. Bit of a light heavyweight prospect. I'm going Magomed Ghadziasulov to win this one by decision. And if he's going to get a finish, it's probably going to be by some sort of fluky submission that he pulls off. Anyway, then we've got Ernesta Kareckaite versus Nicolle Caliare. Kareckaite, she's a former kickboxer. She comes from like a kickboxing background where she did all right in kickboxing. Comes over to MMA. Just has a decent run in MMA, I guess, outside the UFC. Gets a win in the Contender Series. Then she loses at UFC 301. Not really much to break down for her. Then for Nicolle, very dangerous fighter. Every single one of her wins coming by way of stoppage. A very crazy fighter if you look at her on the regional scene, where she got a lot of finishes coming up to the UFC. Gets a contract, well, gets a chance to fight in the Contender Series, gets a submission in that too, and now she's got a contract to fight in the UFC. I can see this fight being a very stand-up heavy fight. Kareckaite, decent takedown defense, likes to keep it on the feet, and because she comes from a kickboxing background and what we've seen in the UFC so far, she seems to be pretty decent on the feet. Caliare, not the most technical striker, a bit of a wild fighter, doesn't really like set up her takedowns or any big shots on the feet. I'm going to go with Kareckaite to win this one by decision. Again, another close fight. I can see Caliare getting a win by finish. If somebody's going to stop the fight, I can see Caliare getting maybe the TKO or pulling off some sort of fluky submission, but I think it's going to be Kareckaite keeping the fight on the feet via takedown defense, because it's not like Caliare's got great takedown offense as well. Her takedowns, like I said, she doesn't really set them up, and I can see it being a bit of a scrappy fight on the feet, in which I'm going to favour the former kickboxer in Kareckaite to win this fight. So I'm going to go with Kareckaite to win this fight by decision. Then we have Jacobe Smith versus Preston Parsons, a short notice fight. It was supposed to be Andreas Gustafsson versus Preston Parsons, and on short notice, it is now Jacobe Smith, which I actually do not favour for Preston Parsons at all. This is a much more dangerous fight, a much more dangerous guy from the Contender Series as well for Preston Parsons, and it's a bad matchup. Jacobe Smith is a complete beast outside the UFC. Kind of reminds me of Rebellious Despain, of how quickly he's finishing his fights. Like, he's finishing people within seconds. His longest finish outside the UFC only took him 3 minutes, so, well, apart from the 2 decisions, but you know what I'm talking about. In terms of finishes, very dangerous guy. Comes over to the Contender Series, dominates with the grappling, and again gets another stoppage on the Contender Series. Preston Parsons is a big grappler. Outside the UFC, every single one of his fights are basically grapple-heavy fights, and he was a big hyped-up submission artist. Comes into the UFC, gets another finish, and then now he's 2-3 in his last 5 fights, where he recently got beaten in a bit of a dogfight by Ogden Elliott. It's a tough fight for Preston Parsons, and I'm going to be going with Jacobe Smith to win this one by first-round knockout. Preston Parsons, he's got a very high-pressure style, and he likes to engage in a dogfight. I would not favour that style when you're facing somebody as dangerous as Jacobe Smith. And it's not even like it's kind of like a classic striker versus grappler matchup. If anything, Jacobe Smith is more of a wrestler, and I'd say he's probably a better wrestler than Preston Parsons. Preston Parsons has a big submission chance, but he's not been able to really put it off in his last couple of fights. He's been looking a bit off. Now that the competition has increased, it's not like Parsons is able to perform. I can see Jacobe Smith chinning him. I can see Preston Parsons putting on the pressure, getting chinned by Jacobe Smith. And if he does shoot a takedown, if anyone's a better wrestler, like I said, it's going to be Jacobe Smith. Looked really good in the Contender Series. Big prospect in the welterweight division. I'm going Jacobe Smith to get this KO in the first round. Preston Parsons, his only chance is if he can somehow out-wrestle Jacobe Smith and get a decision win, which I don't think happening. Or if he can pull off some sort of submission, but I can only see that happening again if Jacobe Smith initiates the takedowns, which I just don't think is going to happen. I'm going Jacobe Smith by first round knockout brutally to continue his hype and make it in the UFC. Then we've got Thiago Moises versus Trey Ogden. Should be much higher on the card. This is a really good fight between two fairly skilled guys. You've got Thiago Moises. Thiago Moises, if you look at his run outside the UFC, he went on a decent run, but it's mainly inside the UFC where he did his best work. I mean, obviously came from the Contender Series, but you look at his work inside the UFC, you might think he's a bit of a win-loss fighter, but you look at the guys he's losing to. He loses to decent fighters: Makhachev, Dariush, Benoit Saint-Denis, Yoel Alvarez, Ludovic Kline, Ismagulov. So he's losing to decent talent in the UFC. He's losing to like top competition fighters. You know, he's beaten the likes of Michael Johnson before as well, Bobby Green. He's had 5 wins outside of that as well, including 3 finishes in one of his more recent fights as well. He's going to be taking on Trey Ogden, who is basically the opposite of a knockout artist, has never finished a single fight by knockout, which I think is somewhat quite humorous to pick out. But if you look at his run outside the UFC, big run outside the UFC, fighting in the likes of Fury FC and LFA, some of the more popular promotions outside the UFC, and had quite a lot of success. He also comes from a very grappling background. He's got a lot of jiu-jitsu accolades. Does Trey Ogden. So far in the UFC, he's not had the best career so far. He's lost to Bahamondes and Jordan Levitt, but he has had an impressive win over Daniel Zeluba, where that fight mainly took place on the feet, and we know how good Daniel Zeluba is on the feet. And he was actually having success on the feet was Trey Ogden. It's a tough fight to pick, but I'm going to go with Moises to win this one by decision. I know a lot of people are picking Ogden because of the jiu-jitsu accolades that he has, as well as the fact that he's pretty good on the feet, but I just trust Thiago Moises. Very dangerous guy, also equally as well-rounded. Didn't even look that bad against Islam Makhachev that long ago. And his recent losses to Ludovic Kline, who's his big 155 prospect, and to Benoit Saint Denis. Apart from that, he's mainly finishing people. I just like how well-rounded Thiago Moises is, as well as the fact that he's so dangerous. Good grappling, good striker. He's faced top competition. I don't really know if I want to be bought on the hype of Trey Ogden yet. Couldn't really get past Bahamondes on the feet. I know that win over Daniel Zeluba was impressive, and he is on a 2-fight winning streak, but I'm going to go with Thiago Moises to win this one by decision. Again, a bit of a coin flip, not an easy one to predict, but I'm going Thiago Moises. Then we have Mario Tulio versus Ihor Potieria. Mario Tulio, good run outside the UFC. Big run outside the UFC, where he trains in the active shoot box with Charles Oliveira. He's also married to Norma Dummett as well, which I just thought I'd slide in there. He's also been praised by the likes of Ian Gary as well. So apparently he's this new big prospect coming out of the shoot box gym that everyone keeps talking about. He did find the Contender Series not too long ago, where he actually ended up winning the fight, but he never got a UFC contract despite getting a win. Then he gets another finish outside of the UFC, where they give him another chance on the Contender Series, where he gets a brutal spinning back body kick finish, and he gets a UFC contract. He's going to be taking on Ihor Potieria, who's a bit of a sacrificial lamb in the UFC. I feel bad for this guy. He went on a big tear outside the UFC. This very dangerous guy outside of the UFC comes into the UFC in 2022, faces Mauricio who gets a finish, kind of gets mocked for celebrating it. But I feel like since then he's just kind of been punished with bad matchups. He faces Carlos Ulberg. He gets finished by Carlos Ulberg. He faces, what's his name? Rodolfo Vieira, gets finished by Rodolfo Vieira. Faces Michel Pereira at UFC 301, gets finished by Michel Pereira. Faces Cesar Almeida, gets eye-poked multiple times in that fight and broken up from the clinch, gets cheated in that fight, and he loses to Cesar Almeida as well. I feel like he's a bit of a sacrificial lamb, but he's very dangerous, or at least he was, at least before the UFC. He's kind of changed his style now. He's not as dangerous, he's not as wild. And he did look alright against Cesar Almeida, but I guess that was only because the competition had decreased. I'm going to go with Mario Tulio to win this one by submission in the first round. Potieria is not as dangerous as he used to be anymore, and I just feel like Mario Tulio could be dangerous everywhere the fight goes. We've seen his style before. Good, solid striker, and he has a decent jiu-jitsu base, which tends to be the case for most fighters that come out of shoot box. I can just see him managing to take the fight to the ground, or maybe dropping Ihor Potieria and then latching on a submission, similar to how Michel Pereira did. Maybe not as quick and as flashy as Michel Pereira, but I can just see him at some point in that first round pulling off a submission. He's got decent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, aggressive Muay Thai. I can see him getting the fight to the ground, whether it be striking or taking him down and finding a submission over the sacrificial lamb in Ihor Potieria, who, even though he's been facing straight killers, hasn't really been able to keep the competition, or hasn't really been able to keep the performances at a top notch. I'm going to go with Mario Tulio to win this one by first round sub. Then we've got Jose Johnson taking on Felipe Bunes. Jose Johnson is the tallest flyweight ever, I think, recorded. It might be. He's definitely one of the tallest flyweights ever. At 6 foot tall at flyweight, 125 pounds and 6 foot tall for a UFC fighter is crazy. If you look at him against the likes of Azul Amabayev, he just completely towers over him. But he had a completely massive amateur career. Most MMA fighters outside the UFC, they've got like an amateur career of like 8 to 10 fights. This dude, he's like a veteran in just a pure amateur scene. So much experience in the amateur scene. He actually ended up fighting the likes of Carlos Hernandez and Charles Johnson in the amateur scene as well. Didn't get past any of them, but he still fought them. And then so far, even outside the UFC in his professional career, he's had a big run where he mainly fought at 135, but now he's cutting down to 155. He came from the Contender Series, got a good win on the Contender Series, got submitted by Damon Blackshear. Then recently beat Chad Enhilliger, came back down to the 125 division and ended up getting not finished, but losing to Azul Amabayev in a pretty dominant fight from Almabayev. He's going to be taking on Felipe Bunes, who again had a decent run outside the UFC, nothing really important to talk about. Goes on a 3-fight losing streak at one point in ACA, ends up getting back another win. Goes on a bit of a run in LFA where he becomes a champion. He was supposed to come over to the UFC against Zaglas, but that fight got cancelled due to apparent steroids. Then he ends up fighting Joshua Van in his UFC debut, and he got finished by Joshua Van, which not many people do. I'm going to go with Jose Johnson to win this one by decision. I just don't really know how good Felipe Bunes is. I know he's got fairly solid jiu-jitsu that he doesn't really rely on. He likes to strike, and then when the fight goes to the ground, that's where he kind of relies on his jiu-jitsu, but he's also got pretty decent wrestling, so he's fairly well-rounded. But I don't even know if he's UFC worth it. I mean, he got finished by Joshua Van, and I know Van's now one of the best boxers in the division, but it's not like he's really known for finishing people, and apart from that, he hasn't been able to pick up a win in the UFC. Even outside the UFC, I mean, a couple losses ago, like I said, he was on a 3-fight losing streak on the regional scene. Jose Johnson, He looked good so far in the... Well, he's looked alright so far in the UFC. He's 2-2 in the UFC, and the guys that he's lost to is Damon Blackshear, one of the best unranked bantamweights, and Azu Almabayev, a ranked flyweight as well, and he only lost to Almabayev by decision. He also got a good submission over Chad Ellinger. I think Jose Johnson's just the better fighter, probably the better striker. I think he's going to do enough to keep the fight on the feet. I don't think he necessarily gets a finish over Felipe Bunes, but I'm going to go with Jose Johnson to get this one in the bag. I don't know why he's cut down to 125. I don't think that benefits him at all in this fight, but I just trust him a little bit more from what I've seen in the UFC. Then we've got Punahele Soriano versus Uros Medic. Two very dangerous guys. Punahele Soriano comes from a big wrestling background, actually trained with the likes of Dan Ige way back, in like a heavy wrestling style background, but he then just decided to strike. In his early UFC career, he kind of turned into a bit of a striker. Comes from the Contender Series by beating Jamie Pickett, and then again turned into a striker in the UFC with 2 brutal knockouts for his first 2 fights in the UFC. Then he goes on a bit of a drop, wins one of his next 5 fights, including a finish loss to Dustin Stolfus and a finish loss to Roman Kopylov, but he recently fought Miguel Baeza, and he went back to his wrestling roots, and he got a win over Baeza as well. And then he's going to be taking on Uros Medic, who is a very dangerous guy. Every single one of his fights have ended in a finish. 8 knockouts, 2 submissions, 0 decisions. As you'd expect, massive run outside the UFC with a bunch of quick finishes. Comes over to the Contender Series, gets a finish, gets another finish in the UFC, gets submitted by Jalin Turner, and then since then he's gone 3-1 in the UFC with his only loss being to Mitabek Orobai, who we know for being one of the most dominant grapplers, and apart from that, he's just finishing everyone. I can guarantee this fight's going to end by some sort of finish, and I'm going to favour it in terms of Uros Medic by KO in the first round. I just don't really know how good Soriano is. I expect him to grapple in this fight because I kind of feel like he's one of those fighters that came from a grappling background, fell in love with their hands, and then it kind of bit them in the back in the future. I think Soriano's a fairly decent wrestler. Not like he's a top wrestler, but that's definitely his biggest advantage. Very powerful guy, but I don't think he's going to risk striking with somebody like Uros Medic, who has the capability to put his lights out, and if he does, might even cut him from the UFC. I just don't really see Soriano doing anything major with the grappling. I think he's definitely the better grappler out of him and Medic, but I think Medic's going to have enough to keep it on the feet. And you look at the guy who we got out-grappled by. He got out-grappled by Mitabek Orobai, one of the most dominant grapplers in the 155-pound division. So I'm going to go Uros Medic to knock him out in the first round. I believe he's a much better striker. His fight IQ is better. I don't really know what Soriano's going through in his UFC career right now. He's moving weight classes. He's switching styles. I'm going to go Uros Medic to win this one by KO in the first round. Then we've got Austin Bashi versus Christian Rodriguez. Austin Bashi, this big prospect, 13-0 outside the UFC. And he's been in a bit of a tear outside the UFC so far. There's Austin Bashi, very grappling heavy style, and he's a pretty decent grappler both with wrestling and jiu-jitsu. Comes over to the Contender Series, displays he's got pretty good striking as well as good grappling, ends up getting a finish on the Contender Series. Going to be taking on Christian Rodriguez, who is a prospect's worst nightmare. Cameron Simon's a prospect, ends up beating Cameron Simon. Raul Rosas Jr. is a prospect, beats him. Isaac Dulgarian's a prospect, ends up beating Isaac Dulgarian. Yes, there was a lot of controversial decisions, but it's kind of like every time there's a prospect, the Christian Rodriguez just beats them. Now, he is moving weight classes to 145 because he has missed weight 3 different times and he's had some controversial decisions. So he's not like he's the most consistent fighter as Christian Rodriguez, but I'm going to go with Austin Bashi to win this one by decision. I think he's a prospect that's going to pass. I know Christian Rodriguez is the prospect killer, the prospect's worst nightmare, but Austin Bashi's looked really good. Looks like a really promising grappler with good wrestling, good striking, and Christian Rodriguez, if you look at some of his fights, he was struggling on the feet with Cameron Simon. He shouldn't have won that Isaac Dulgarian fight. Raul Rosas Jr., who's a heavy jiu-jitsu guy, was able to take him down. You put him against Austin Bashi, a much bigger guy with much better wrestling, solid jiu-jitsu, decent stamina, and a much better striker than some of those guys. I think Austin Bashi is going to pass the test. He's had some good experience outside the UFC, and I think Christian Rodriguez moving up is in for a bit of a, I'm not going to say a rude awakening because I'm picking him to win by decision, but I'm going to go Austin Bashi to get into the UFC and win this fight by decision over Christian Rodriguez. He's a good prospect to look out for in the 145 division, and I think he'll beat Christian Rodriguez. Then we've got Chris Curtis versus Roman Kopylov, that I personally think should at least have been the co-main event for this card. This is a really good fight. You've got Chris Curtis, who's one of the saltiest fighters in the UFC. You see this dude on Twitter or on social media, he'll be complaining about everything. So salty. But he had a decent run outside the UFC, fought in the likes of PFL where he got some wins over Andre Fiallo, who's now in the UFC. Also went in a 3-fight losing streak in PFL. Then after that, he went in a bit of a win streak in different promotions. Comes over to the UFC, knocks out Phil Hawes, knocks out Brendan Allen, and goes in a bit of a run in the UFC, becomes a bit of a prospect. Actually had the record for takedown defense at one point. I'm pretty sure he had a record of like a 100% takedown defense in the UFC. I mean, he was holding a record for that at some point in his career. So he's got solid boxing and takedown defense, but he's now kind of been done dirty in his most recent fights. He had a controversial close fight with Jack Hermansson. Then he knocks out Buckley. He had a controversial close fight with Kelvin Gastelum. He had a no contest with Nasruddin Imavov, and then he had another close, controversial fight on short notice against Brendan Allen. So he's kind of been done dirty in a lot of his recent fights. He's losing by the skin of his teeth, and he's a very tough guy for anyone. Roman Kopylov was this big striking prospect outside the UFC. Actually had a bad start to his UFC career, gets submitted in his UFC debut and then loses quite a close decision. But then after that, he became a bit of a prospect in himself with a 4-fight winning streak. All of them ended by way of finish, where we saw some pretty brutal finishes by Roman Kopylov. And he's probably one of my favorite fighters to watch in the middleweight division. If that hadn't been for the fight, well, obviously he lost to Anthony Hernandez as well, got dominated. But if it hadn't been for the fight against Cesar Almeida, where he fought Cesar Almeida and he kind of didn't strike with him, I thought there was going to be a really fun kickboxing match between two strikers, and he kind of just did have a bit of a boring grappling match with Cesar Almeida. So I'm hoping Roman Kopylov hasn't changed since the Hernandez fight, but I'm going to be picking him to win this one by decision. Tough fight for Kopylov. I know there's no way there's any grappling involved in this fight. Roman Kopylov doesn't have the option to take it to the ground because Curtis is a much better grappler, at least has much better takedown defense. On the feet, Curtis is the more... I mean, they're both very dangerous. Curtis hits like a truck. Kopylov's a very dangerous striker, but I just think Kopylov's a more diverse striker. Curtis is the same style in every fight, which kind of shocked me when he said that there's going to be spies coming into his camp from Roman Kopylov to spy on him. He's a very basic fighter. Pressure boxing, that's all he does. Pressure defensive boxing. Roman Kopylov, he likes to mix things up. He likes to keep you guessing on the feet. As a very kind of crafty kickboxer is Roman Kopylov, and I think he is the better striker out of Chris Curtis. It's going to be a close kickboxing fight. I think it's going to be a really fun fight on the feet, but I do think Roman Kopylov's a better striker and will pull through by decision. I don't really see him getting a stoppage over Chris Curtis. Curtis is defensively very sound, and if anyone's going to get a stoppage in fact, it's probably going to, in my opinion, going to be Curtis by like clocking Kopylov, but I'm going Kopylov to win this one by decision. Then we've got Abdul Razak Al Hassan versus Cesar Almeida. Abdul Razak Al Hassan, very dangerous guy. 12 wins, 100% of these wins coming by way of KO and TKO, so he's a very dangerous and powerful guy on the feet, which is crazy because he actually comes from a grappling background in judo. As you'd expect, all of his wins outside the UFC, all by KO in the first round, so he was a big prospect coming into the UFC, even won on Bellator a few times. Comes into the UFC, wins his 4 of his first 5 fights. Again, all of them coming by way of first round knockout. This guy was a huge prospect, and now he's kind of, well, then he kind of flipped it around. He ended up winning one of his next 5 fights, was in a bit of a tough career spot, and now in his last 3 fights, he's had a knockout over Ribeiro. He lost to Joe Pyfer by submission, and he had a no contest over Cody Brundage. In the fact that he was kind of dominating, to be fair. He's going to be taking on Cesar Almeida, former Glory kickboxing fighter, comes from a kickboxing background. Actually beat Alex Pereira in kickboxing at one point as well, but now he trains with Porton. In his first 3 MMA fights, he got 3 first-round knockouts in a row. And then he comes from the Contender Series, gets a good win on the Contender Series, finishes his first fight in the UFC, and in his most recent fight, actually not his most recent fight, second most recent fight, he got taken down and kind of dominated by Roman Kopylov. But then he pulled off a win over Ihor Potieria, which, to be fair, the referee was completely on his side in that fight. I'm going to be picking Cesar Almeida to win this one by decision. Al Hassan's a very dangerous guy, but Cesar Almeida, I'd say he's the much better kickboxer. Very good kickboxer, Cesar Almeida, very dangerous. He's now training with the likes of Porton, and obviously he's fought him before. Comes from this big Glory kickboxing background. Al Hassan isn't necessarily the best kickboxer from a technique perspective. It's just the guy hits so damn hard. I don't really see there being any grappling in this fight from Al Hassan. It's not like he's known for his grappling. Like I said, he comes from a judo background, but he never uses it. I mean, Joe Pyfer was able to put him to sleep with grappling, so I think Cesar Almeida is going to pick him apart for the majority of the fight, and I think as the fight goes on as well, it's only going to favour Cesar Almeida. Al Hassan is like one of these really dangerous fighters in the first round, but as he gets out of the first round, he kind of gasses out a bit. I can see Cesar Almeida being the much more better, well, just the much better kickboxer, the much more consistent throughout the fight. I'm going Cesar Almeida to win this one by decision. Then we've got Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Colston Harris, a bit of a veterans fight in the co-main event. Santiago Ponzinibbio, like I said, a bit of a veteran, been competing in MMA since 2008. Came into the UFC from the Ultimate Fighter back in 2013. Had a solid start to his UFC career, only losing 2 fights, and had wins over the likes of he had some good finishes, including wins over the likes of Sean Strickland, Neil Magny, and Mike Perry. But now he's on a bit of a... he's not really on a losing streak because most of them are split decisions, but he's in a tough career spot where if he loses another fight, he might be cut from the UFC. Going to be taking on Colston Harris, who again had a decent run outside of the UFC, fighting Wellington Turman and beating him, who was obviously a UFC fighter as well. Also beat Michel Pereira, which is another notable win. I've seen a lot of Brazilians on like the Contender Series or Brazilian prospects who have come over, and you check their record, they've got Michel Pereira as a win, so it seems like Michel Pereira didn't do the best on the regional scene. But anyway, Colston Harris, he's had a decent run in the UFC so far. 3 submission wins. with 2 losses, but the 2 losses were to Chaos Williams and Shavkat Ramonov. Chaos Williams hits like a truck and Shavkat. So he's had a pretty solid run in the UFC so far. It's a close fight. I'm going to go Ponzinibbio to win this one, though. I think the veteran's going to take over. If you look at most of Ponzinibbio's recent wins, a lot of them are split decisions. Split decision over Jeff Neal, split decision over Michel Pereira, split decision over Muslim Salikov. The only fight where he got finished recently was obviously Li Jingliang and Kevin Holland. Apart from that, he's been winning. Well, he's not been winning fights, but he's been losing fights by the skin of his teeth. He's definitely the better striker against Carlston Harris. I think he keeps the fight on the feet and picks him apart. Carlston Harris has the opportunity to take the fight to the mat, but it's not that Ponzinibbio has bad takedown defense necessarily. I mean, he fought a grappler, and Alex Morono was able to keep the fight on the feet and piece him up as well. So I think Ponzinibbio is going to keep the fight on the feet with his solid takedown defense and just kind of pick apart Carlston Harris from the majority of the fight and pull off a decision win. And then we've got the main event, Mackenzie Dern versus Amanda Ribas. Bit of a weak main event to start 2025, but it is what it is. And they've obviously fought before. Amanda Ribas won a pretty dominant fight, but Mackenzie Dern, former grappler, comes from a big grappling background, especially jiu-jitsu. That's kind of what brought her into the UFC. She only had a couple of fights outside the UFC before making it to the big league, and she was once a big prospect. She obviously lost to Amanda Ribas, but apart from that loss to Amanda Ribas, she was doing pretty well in the UFC, pulling off a couple of submissions. And then she ended up, well, now she's in a bit of a career spot where she's seen the top competition of the UFC and she's been falling short. You know, she got battered by Jessica Andrade, she got beaten by Lemos, beaten by Yang Xiaonan, beaten by Marina Rodriguez, and the wins that she's picking over, she looked really good against Angela Hill. She pulled off a decent win over Godinez and Pennington, but there's not really much to talk about from her, and she did recently get submitted in a grappling match too. Going to be taking on Amanda Ribas, who, again, had a pretty decent run outside the UFC, with only lost being to Poliana Viana, another UFC fighter. Starts off a UFC career pretty well, obviously beating Mackenzie Dern, got a win over Paige Van Sant as well. And now she's also a bit of a win-loss fighter, where you put her against the top competition, she loses, but she's able to keep it in the rankings. She's a tough fight to call, like I said, a bit of a win-loss fighter, but I'm going to go with Amanda Ribas to win this one by TKO in the 4th round. Again, we've seen this fight before, and Amanda Ribas won the fight very comfortably. And I just don't really see why this fight would be any different nowadays. I think Dern's only chance is if she can take the fight to the mat and keep it with the jiu-jitsu, but she's a terrible striker as Mackenzie Dern. You say, you know, a lot of these like boxers and strikers, they say, you know, some fighters take one to eat one. Mackenzie Dern takes about 5 shots to barely land one. She's very, like, vulnerable on the feet. She's not good defensively. Amanda Ribas, I can see her picking apart Mackenzie Dern on the feet, especially with how Amanda Ribas has been looking recently. Mackenzie Dern's a terrible striker. Now, Mackenzie Dern did look good with the wrestling and the grappling in her recent fight against Godinez, especially against Angela Hill. But Amanda Ribas has good takedown defense. I think she's a lot more well-rounded, especially across 5 rounds, where I think Mackenzie Dern's kind of crazy style isn't going to be favourable for her. I can see her getting gassed out in that 4th round, and I can see a late stoppage from Amanda Ribas by TKO. So I'm going to go TKO from Amanda Ribas in round 4 as the first main event finish of 2025. But those are my predictions of UFC Vegas 101. Not the best card to start 2025, but it is what it is. Let me know your thoughts on this card. If you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.